Right. What's up, class of 2022? This is a video I've been wanting to do for a long time. And for the class of 22 more than ever, there's such a great interest on both sides of the fence. And what I'm talking about are our PWIs, predominantly white institutions, and our HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. Which one should I be looking at? Which one should I, you know, lean towards? And I'm happy that over the course of the year, students have really kind of weighed their options on both sides. Many of our seniors had come into senior year with a very clear position on the two institutions. And so I really welcomed that, and I really wanted you to explore on your own. But one thing I did want to begin to chime in as we are in the spring semester, and we're in that process of starting to make some decisions and refine our choices, we have to begin to explore and dig deeper into the institutions and what they can do for us short and long term. So I apologize, this is not going to be, hey, you should do this or you should do that. But in a role that I kind of hold, I think it's great for me to shed light on the advantages and the disadvantages of both. And that will hopefully help you in your process. The first thing I definitely always want to say is that certainly it is impossible to make brash generalizations about any institution or any type, because we should know that there are over 100 HBCUs, and trust me, they are not 100% alike. So it is impossible to make blanket statements about any and every institution. As we know about PWIs, there are thousands of them, and certainly they are wildly different. So what I want to do is certainly just give you the best information that I can that speaks on as much as possible to capture the essence of both, right? And where does this information come from? My information comes from three different sources. Number one, Southland students. In talking to our students as the director of alumni affairs, I get really good insight in terms of what's happening on campuses right now. And I think that's extremely important. Number two, I do watch a lot of videos that are produced by individual students. I don't just go with the websites and the brochures. I love to hear candid feedback from other students outside of Southland to get multiple perspectives. And then finally, I just do my homework and do my research and read as much as humanly possible. I know you guys don't have that kind of time, so I try to read on your behalf, right? And the last thing I'm going to say, and this is probably huge before you begin any discussion or evaluation of what schools are like and which is best for you, you have to understand that one, this is your choice and no one else's. Number two, it's your life, so in that sense, you are an individual. So what is going to work for you may not work for another individual. And that's really important to know. And finally, this is the big one. You come from Southland, right? And so Southland and the Southland community is very, very unique. And I think you should evaluate both types of schools in relation to where you are coming from. So you should bear in mind, number one, you go to a predominantly Black high school, right? This video is not just intended for Black students, for our white students, our Latino students, our Asian students, our biracial students. I believe this information is going to be relevant for you as well. But you have to recognize that you come from a predominantly Black high school. You also come from a very small high school, right? A high school that is under 600 students is categorically small. And you should bear that in mind when you're thinking about your next step. Finally, you belong to the South suburban community in the Chicagoland area. Again, that is a very unique circumstance. The South suburban community is very similar to Chicago in the sense that it is highly segregated. The pocket of the South suburbs that Southland students belong to is very segregated, and it's mostly populated by people of color, predominantly African-American, predominantly middle class, but there is a little bit of diversity in terms of economic status. But we hail from the Chicagoland area, and the South suburbs is a microcosm of the city. And you must recognize that growing up in a suburban urban area that is highly segregated is something you have to pay in mind. And so you are not in a community that is very diverse along ethnic boundaries. And I think that should factor well into your decision-making process and evaluating schools through that lens. So I think all of that is important before you start really thinking about what school is going to be best for me. You have to know who you are and you have to know where you're from. Okay. As far as what you've heard, one thing you always have to bear in mind is that if you're getting your information from YouTube channels and you're getting it from TikTok and from social media, you have to recognize that those are manufactured things. You should not watch one TikTok and say, oh, wow, that is how that school is. That is very, very, very dangerous, right? Because one, we should all know at this point, social media is not real and it is a manufactured piece. And traditionally, it's for an agenda. You know, you want likes, you want it to get some attention, you want it to go viral. So I would be very careful with taking things from social media at face value. I think it's good information. It's good to get new perspectives, but do not swallow, an Instagram post whole to say this is what this school is like. That is dangerous, and we should know by now. That's one of the great aspects of social media that's exciting, but one of the things that can be terribly misleading. We know that the people who present themselves on social media are somewhat real, but they're also somewhat manufactured for a definitive purpose. Okay, so I'm sorry for all that prologue, but I think it's very important before we even begin that discussion that you have those things in mind. All right, now I think it would be great if you had something to take notes with because I don't have my little video things to pop things in and out. But I think it would be helpful to kind of jot down some notes of what I'm sharing. I'm going to go pro for PWIs and pro for HBCUs. So we can talk about all the great things. The greatest news I have for you, great news. I think you're going to be fine whatever you choose because college is exciting. It doesn't matter if you go to a predominantly white school or an HBCU. It can be exciting. It can be the best times of your life. It will be a period of exploration. It will be a time for you to learn about things that you care about in ways that you cannot do in high school. You're going to develop relationships, friendships that will last a lifetime. So it don't matter, yo. It don't matter at all. And you should be excited about that. So we're going to start about all the pros. So we'll go HBCU because it starts with the letter H and we'll go first. And I think the greatest advantage of an HBCU is the culture. You hear that a million times. The supportive, exciting culture of an HBCU is really the draw, for a student, particularly African-American students, to go to a place of higher education, that you are surrounded by people who are wanting to learn more about their craft and prepare for their careers is a really exciting place to be. So I think that is by far, the biggest advantage, the strength of HBCUs. And again, thanks to social media, you're able to kind of bear witness to that in ways that you previously wouldn't. So in other words, you kind of have access to see that at work. And I think that is by far the greatest advantage. And I think that is important because you want to be someplace where you're excited. You want to be someplace where you're going to develop and grow. And you want to be at a place that, cares about you. And I think by and large, HBCUs do care about their students. So that's the greatest pro, right? The next is something that I think a lot of students don't really consider. And a lot of people who criticize HBCUs don't really think deeply about. Many people tend to fault HBCUs for suggesting that they're not diverse and they don't reflect, quote unquote, the real world because it's all Black for the most part. I kind of push on that a little bit. I think that HBCUs, another pro, is that they really showcase the diversity of the African-American community. So yes, while the majority of the students there will be of African-American descent, you're going to quickly find out that there isn't a singular African-American narrative. There isn't a single African-American group of people. You're going to meet African-Americans who are so different based on region, based on their economic status and based on their perspectives. So you're going to meet African Americans who are staunch Republicans and Democrats. You're going to meet African Americans who come from very, very wealthy, affluent families, and those who have come from dirt poor situations. And certainly you're going to meet African Americans from all over the nation, by and large at most HBCUs, and to some extent internationally, meeting Africans and African Americans from around the world. So there's a good diversity there, and it will help you see just what that is. Coming from Southland, a very homogeneous South suburban community, there is some homogeneity. So there's some similarities here, but at HBCUs, I think that is put on showcase that there isn't a singular African American narrative. The third pro is something that I think, again, students don't think about coming out of Southland. The transition from high school to college in some ways can be easier because obviously when you transition into college from high school, it can be daunting, it can be scary. Moving out of your parents' home and being on your own is a little frightening, especially at first, the first few weeks, maybe the first month. But when you go to an HBCU, because you are not, quote unquote, in the minority, that transition can be a lot easier. Not for everyone, but I think that is a pro, that you don't have to, step outside of your comfort zone as much as you will going to a PWI. Now, that does speak to some of the cons, but we're on the pros right now. And so I do believe something that shouldn't be ignored is that your transition can be easier. It comes with its pitfalls, but it can be easier at the beginning. And to that, also, most HBCUs are relatively small. To put it out there, I think there are less than 4 HBCUs that have more than 10,000 students. So that should let you know that in the world of colleges, most HBCUs are smaller. So another pro is going to be kind of the smaller, more intimate environment. More people are going to know you. They're going to know who you are. The more professors are going to kind of know who you are because it is a smaller community. And for that, that's going to help develop relationships between students and faculty. You probably will get to know professors at a smaller school than you will at large universities. Again, that's a generalization. You can certainly get to know certain professors at larger institutions, especially when you're a junior and senior and your classes are really small. But at HBCUs, that is the entire community. So that's another pro that you should think about, the smaller, intimate environment, right? Another pro, and this is a great one, it's really about the pride and the motivation of the alumni. At HBCUs, you should know that students who graduate from those institutions are really, really excited about being a graduate and a member of that family, very similar to Southland. And so alumni are really, really, really motivated to show pride for their HBCUs. And fortunately, for those who are in positions of power, influence, and things of that nature, they're trying to do everything they can to open those opportunities to HBCU students and graduates. So that's a great piece. And I think the perfect example about HBCUs is the concept of homecoming. And as you guys know, homecoming is usually a celebration weekend surrounded by a sporting event. But what you'll notice is that HBCUs, the concept of homecoming isn't just about that celebration and that sporting event. It's really because the alumni come home, homecoming. And so you will see on most HBCU campuses, homecoming is really associated with the alumni coming back. And that's a really positive thing, and it's a great thing to experience. So these are really, really, that's a really great pro for HBCUs. Finally, something that people just don't think about, and I think is another pro, is that the programming, specifically, speakers and lectures and social events and parties, things of that nature, when you're no longer a minority, so to speak, these events are planned with you in mind. Okay, so pretty much everything that happens at an HBCU is planned for you. And that's a pro, knowing that what's being put out there is for you and not for any other group or organization or a group of people is a pro. So when there are social events, everything about it is planned with African American students in mind. So again, that can be a pro as well, in comparison with larger predominantly white institutions where the majority of social events, especially, are not planned for the quote unquote minorities in mind. So that's another pro on the side of HBCUs. As you can see, I could go all day. I did not attend an HBCU. Again, I always like to say that, but I have really been well informed by students who have matriculated in HBCUs from Southland, and certainly others that I've worked with, associates, et cetera. And just to throw a shout out, my wife is a proud alum of an HBCU. She's a graduate of Hampton University in Hampton, Virginia. So I'm sure if she were here, she would co-sign on a lot of that. And that's that. So let's move on to the pros for PWIs. Again, there are pros on both sides of the coin. On the PWI side, there are, obviously tons of advantages and amenities that go with attending a PWI. I would say just right out of the gate, I think the resources that PWIs provide is a huge draw. Because the reality in the history, the reason why they are historically Black college universities is that there was a need to create, for African Americans, because the predominantly white institutions were building these grand institutions without us in mind. We weren't allowed to attend. And so the reality is, for having hundreds of years of ability to build these institutions have tremendous facilities. Okay, so when you go to a PWI, you should know that everywhere you go, you're going to have probably the best of the best facilities. The residence halls are going to be very nice. The athletic facilities for you to be able to work out and enjoy recreation are going to be outstanding. When you talk about food, and we know university food is never going to be, the best, but you should know there's going to be an abundance of food and different options and dining options and kosher and non-kosher. You're going to have really, really, really state-of-the-art facilities. And when we're talking about some of the higher end PWIs, we're also talking about sporting events and stadiums and things of that nature. The facilities are going to be top-notch. And if there's anything that's wrong with the facilities, they have the resources to make it right really fast. So that is just huge. I mean, you kind of get a lot for what you pay for. And I think that's something that, you have to always remember, is that you're going to probably make some sort of investment, at least in time and probably in money. And in my opinion, you always want to get a lot for what you pay for. In terms of the facilities, you're going to get it at a PWI. And what goes along hand in hand with that is the customer service and the professionalism. Things get done faster at PWIs. Just the reality is, when you submit something, they're going to get it. When you send an email, you're going to get a response. When you go to an office, there's going to be a secretary. Someone's going to see you quickly. We can't always say that for schools with less resources, and the reality is HBCUs have less. So one major point of difference and a pro for PWIs is the response time, the professionalism, the customer service that you're going to receive at a larger, predominantly white institution. Again, for the most part, you're going to get things handled. And for a college student, especially when you're busy, that comes in handy in a big way. Next pro, I think, is very important and something that students don't think about, because you're young, right? And when we're young, we're going to think in the short term. We're going to think on how things are going to benefit us right now. But you have to recognize one of the greatest pros for PWIs is the notoriety. The reality is, America is predominantly white at this point. Things are certainly changing, but we also know that the power dynamic in terms of employers, in terms of influence and power, it is certainly, slanted in the area of white people and white-run organizations, companies, et cetera. And so one of the biggest pros for PWIs is that when it comes down to it, at the end of 4 years, PWIs are going to be a great repository for employers. Employers are going to come, and there's going to be lots of companies that are going to be hiring. And when they go out and they're looking for people to join their teams and offer jobs, they're going to know some PWIs a lot more than HBCUs. Again, that is a brash generalization, but the reality is, your largely widely known PWIs are going to be more widely known by employers. And that will position you for probably, tremendous opportunities and lots of opportunities. So at a PWI, when you graduate, you may have interviews with 20, 30 different companies because they won't have 50 employers on campus. They may have 500 employers on campus. And so that is a huge pro. Okay, how does this school prepare me for my next opportunities? Remember, we're not coming to college for a party. We're coming to really plant the seeds for our futures as professionals and as adults. And on the professional side, that's a big deal. And to that notoriety, that pro, that does also bring a value of the degree, not just in the short term, but in the long term. Okay, so you have to remember that 10 years after graduation, you may change careers, you may shift into another field, you may join a different company. And when you have a resume with a university or college that is widely known, that's going to come back and continue to have value. So being a part of a PWI, which is more widely known, means more notoriety, which means more value of your degree. Okay, that's something you cannot discount in the short term and in the long term, because again, your degree is going to follow you for the rest of your life, and you want it to have a tremendous value, because when you go out into the workforce, you want people to look at your resume and say, "Oh, that university, I know that university." When you're dealing with a very white country or a very white Asian and Latino country, when you look at a country that is a smaller percentage African American, going to a predominantly white institution is going to have you more known. Okay, so that's another pro. I think the other piece I think is really interesting, and again, a lot of students don't think about it, are the resources at PWIs as they pertain to quote unquote minorities. When you are the minority at a school, most people think of that as a disadvantage. But what a lot of students will tell you, and a lot of students never think about, is that, when you are one of the few at a larger school, what the students always say is that you kind of always get the opportunities. You always get the plug. What do I mean by that? So when you are looking for a job, right? If you are one of the few African Americans who are there interviewing for the position, you're going to be noticed automatically. And if they're looking for, a talented African American or a talented Latino student, and there aren't many around, what does that mean? That means there's going to be more opportunities for you. That's something that people really don't think about, but is extremely, extremely true. Okay, so when there are opportunities, when there are jobs on campus, when it's time to send students, abroad, when it's time to send them to a special program in Washington, D.C., when you want to apply for a resident advisor position in the dormitories or the residence halls, they're going to be looking for people, and they want people that are going to reflect the diversity of the university. And if there are only a handful, guess what? There's going to be a multitude of opportunities. All right. So you're going to be that quote unquote Black person that's going to get that opportunity here, there, and everywhere, because there are only so many. So I think that's something that people don't think about as a huge pro at PWIs. It's kind of the inverse thing. And the greatest advantage of being a minority in a majority community is that you are always going to get the plug. Okay. There are going to be lots of opportunities with few people to fill them as it pertains to diversity. You are going to stand out in a way that is going to be to your benefit. Okay. So that's a big one. Now, a few other quick things. I think a big argument that has always been posited for generations is that PWI reflects the real world. Okay, and that's true. I'm not going to argue that, and there are some shortcomings to that as well. But one thing that is incontrovertible, one thing that is true, is that when you attend a PWI, it is going to be more of a microcosm or a reflection of what the quote unquote world is going to be when you graduate from college. And so for that reason, this is a big pro as well. You are going to be, put in a position where you have to learn how to deal with people from different cultures, from different regions, from different economic standpoints, from different perspectives, in ways that, truth be told, may not be as comfortable. Okay, we mentioned that in HBCUs, the transition may be easier, but people would argue with PWIs, the transition is going to be more difficult, but it's going to be more preparatory. Okay, it's going to prepare you so that when you graduate from college, you do have experience in working with different people, and living with different people, and socializing with different people, and coming to understand, reflect, celebrate, and appreciate the differences. Okay, I think this is a big one for Southland students because it is going to be a little uncomfortable in that transition because you have come from a very segregated community from a very predominantly Black high school. And so going to a PWI is going to give you a really, really good education in terms of learning how to explore and meet people who look different than you. And some people will see that as something that's scary and frightening. The pro side would say, one, that's going to be enlightening. You're going to find out that people who don't look like you are not bad people. Some of them are. But what you're going to find is that you're going to have a lot of things in common that you never realized. Just in the same way with HBCUs, being able to showcase and show you there's a diversity within the African-American community that is beautiful. A PWI is going to show you the diversity of our country that is beautiful in ways that you probably don't know and you need to know. All right. And finally, when you do quote unquote enter the real world, you won't be shocked with that transition. You will enter the job force. You will take that job position. You will go off to med school or law school, and you won't have to deal with the fact that, oh, wow, I'm around people who aren't all Black, because you've been doing that for the last 4 years. That's a big pro. And it, can be seen as a con or a disadvantage of PWI. But on that, and then from that perspective, it's an extremely important advantage because it is, to some extent, preparing you for the real world. All right. The last thing I'll say is that, again, this is, rationalization. It doesn't apply to all PWIs. But when you talk about events and specifically, social things, athletic programming, it's just big. It's big, it's exciting, and it's fun. So if you're into sports, if you aren't into sports, but always wanted to kind of discover more about it, most PWIs are going to have vibrant sporting opportunities with, again, grand facilities and stadiums. The textbook pieces, of course, football on college campuses. It is an exciting thing. And at PWIs, it just takes it to another level. And it really brings people together in ways that you cannot imagine and you will never see anywhere else. You may have been to pro sports, NFL or NBA, but when you go to college, you'll get to see not only that great competitive spirit, but that pride that goes with being on a college campus. Just in the same way that alumni are extremely proud and motivated at HBCUs. You're going to see that at PWIs at a very high level. And so it's just great to see that in relation to, just the vastness and the excitement of, athletic programs and events in that way. And the coolest part about that is it's going to open up opportunities for you to meet and engage and even hang out with different circles of people. So at a PWI, you can hang out as a part of kind of the African American community within the larger community, because a lot of PWIs might seem like, oh, there's not a lot of Black people. But as I've shared with many of you, most PWIs have more Black students than HBCUs. Okay, so you will be, you'll be the minority at a PWI, but there may be 2,000 Black students at that campus. So you'll have the opportunity to kind of involve yourself and engage in that circle. But there are other circles. You can explore and get to know people within the Latino community and Latino circles. And then you can certainly explore and hang out and socialize and get to know people in the quote unquote white circles and in the Asian circles. And because of that, there are a lot of what I call concentric circles. So there are various circles that you can involve yourself with all at the same time. So at a PWI, you can go to a fraternity party or an AKA party on a Friday. On Saturday, you can hang out and go do some great cultural things in the Latin community. And on Sunday, you can be a part of a professional organization and be at an event that is predominantly white with some Black and Latinos. And in doing that, you're now building different circles of people that you engage with. And you can find that you can go in between and in and out in ways that you cannot do at an HBCU. So there is that diversity in a good way, and the diversity that will give you the great opportunity to explore. Okay, so those are my pros for PWIs. As you can see, there are tons for HBCUs and PWIs, and I'm going to spend a little time talking about the disadvantages, because the reality is that every school is going to have disadvantages, but I want to highlight the disadvantages that people don't think about at HBCUs and PWIs. So we're not going to spend near as much time on those, but important to know. Okay, that being said, let's get into it. With HBCUs, one of the disadvantages just speaks to the advantage of PWIs. A lot of people argue that PWIs kind of prepare you for the real world. One of the disadvantages of HBCUs is in protecting you and having that supportive culture that looks like you and making an easy transition. It can fail to prepare you for the real world. Many African-American students who leave HBCUs have to deal with the shock and transition of entering the real world after being at an HBCU. And an HBCU can make you very comfortable, but then it makes it a little challenging for that transition when you hit the quote unquote real world. Now, this isn't to say that you won't be able to make that transition, but that is, one of the disadvantages is that HBCU communities do not reflect the real world in that way from an ethnic standpoint. I think, another piece is that at an HBCU, a disadvantage is that you're going to have a smaller community. And that can be an advantage because you kind of get to know people and it's supportive and it's welcoming. But the disadvantage is that can quickly translate into people in your business, right? A small community, information travels real fast. And that's good information, that's bad information, and unfortunately, that can be misinformation. So your world becomes real small, real fast, okay? It's one thing to go to a small high school when you go home and you're in a different circle. It's one thing to go to a small high school when you're not of age and you're not doing a lot. But when you're in college and you all live together and you have a lot more freedom and you're doing things, when it's a small world, things can get small real fast. Hopefully you can read between the lines of what I'm saying there. but that is definitely a disadvantage of HBCUs. When you do things, people find out, and then it's in your business, and people are in your business because it's a very small community. And to that, one of the things that you have to know at HBCUs is because of the small community, and due to the attrition of male students, that small community gets smaller, and it becomes imbalanced. So again, a great disadvantage at HBCUs, most of them anyway, is that there's going to be a huge imbalance between the male and female ratio. And you might not think that's a big deal, but when it comes down to relationships, that can be interesting, right? And what you should know is that many HBCUs have a huge imbalance between men and women. And I believe the ratio is commonly, by the time you're a third-year student at HBCUs, it's usually about 14 women to each male. Now, depending on how you look at that, that may be a disadvantage. For others, it might be an advantage. But when you have that imbalance, that makes things very tricky. I'll just leave it at that. Another disadvantage of HBCU is, again, to the counter of a PWI. You don't stand out at an HBCU. So when you're looking for opportunities, you're looking for those jobs, you're looking to be in those programs, you don't stand out. You're just one of many African Americans that are looking for it. So you are not unique in that sense when it comes down to the opportunities that are presented to the campus community in terms of jobs, resources, programs, leadership positions, and titles. You're not going to stand out. You're going to be just one of many. So you have to make sure that you stand out in ways that will make you. Whereas at PWIs, you don't really have to worry about that, because one of the advantages of being a minority is that you will stand out in ways that can benefit you. Okay. Another, kind of disadvantage is the fact that the reality is that HBCUs are less well known in the public sphere. Okay. In mainstream, quote unquote, majority culture, HBCUs by name do not have the notoriety. And so what does that mean? That means that you're going to have less employers coming to those schools. Doesn't mean you're not going to have any, but there's going to be a markedly less volume of employers that are going to come looking for you because they just don't know the schools. Okay. I could name a bunch of PWIs that, quote unquote, majority culture, majority employers are going to be very familiar with, know their reputation, and are going to go hire and look for their next, CEOs and great employees. But HBCUs are going to be less well known. And that's going to have an impact on your options and opportunities after college. And again, just as I talked about in the long run, the value of your degree, 10 years after graduation, you may be wanting to change careers. You may want to make a shift. You may want to go to a new employer. Again, that lack of notoriety at most HBCUs doesn't help, right? So that's a disadvantage. When people know less of you and you're less well known, that's going to translate into less opportunities. And I think, again, you want to get the most of what you pay for. And in that way, in terms of, that ability to use that degree to turn it into opportunities for you, you're going to have less, and that's just stark reality. And you just got to say that. And the last thing I'm going to say, oh no, there's going to be two. Last two things I'm going to say is, again, getting what you pay for. Probably the greatest knock on HBCUs is the lack of resources and the lack of facilities, right? At HBCUs, because they have less resources, a lot of things just move slower. And trying to get things done, it takes more time. The expression that people use is that it's bootleg. You just have to really work harder to get things done, and you just have less at HBCUs in terms of the quality of the facilities and things getting repaired quicker, or the age of the facilities. Things are older, and so again, as I shared earlier, you're going to make an investment. You're going to at least make it in terms of time, and you're going to make it in terms of money. HBCUs can be less expensive than PWIs, but what are you getting for it? Are you getting your money's worth? All right. And I know you guys have probably heard the stories and the protests at Howard University this year. And the reality is, that is par for the course at most HBCUs. The facilities do need to be improved. And I don't think they're trying to be evil about it. It's just they have a lack of resources. And that's a disadvantage at an HBCU, is that because of the paucity of resources, a lot of times the facilities are not going to be up to par. And that's a not, right? And the final thing I'm going to say, because I cannot forget this, there's a good side and there's a bad side to everything, right? And so I think the greatest thing about an HBCU is how exciting it is, how it has a really supportive culture. And it's just a great time because everything is planned with you in mind. The flip side to that, because everything is planned with you in mind, especially socially speaking, that can be dangerous, right? Because if everything social is planned with you in mind, that can be a huge pitfall. The one of the things you have to be mindful of at HBCUs is that it can be difficult to focus on what you're there for. The academic side of things can quickly fall to the wayside because there's so much exciting things going on a daily basis. You may lose that focus. Okay. We all know that HBCUs have a substantially low graduation rate in comparison to PWIs. And many of you guys have asked me about that. And that's true. I do think it's unfair to evaluate HBCUs in that way, because the graduation rate is affected by a lot of things that, I think really misrepresent HBCUs. But one of the disadvantages of HBCUs is that a lot of students don't finish. And one of the reasons is because it's so exciting. A lot of students will lose focus. And it's hard because it can be distracting to the point where it will impede upon your academic performance. And certainly remember, that's what we're there for. We're there to learn. We're there to really better ourselves and position ourselves for our professional futures and our adult futures. So that's something you got to be careful with at the disadvantage side, is that it can be too much fun, and that can sometimes be problematic. The focus on academics at HBCUs sometimes can lay to the wayside on the social. Okay, so those are kind of the disadvantages, or the pitfalls, I should say, for HBCUs. So a little bit of both. On the PWI side, I got plenty, but I want to focus on a couple. I think the biggest disadvantage speaks to, again, the advantage. I mentioned earlier that you have the great opportunities as a quote unquote minority at a PWI, because there's so many opportunities with few to fill them. And so for that reason, on the disadvantages, I think one of the disadvantages of PWIs is that there is this diversity. There is an ethnic diversity, but there's not inclusion. Okay, what you'll find at PWIs, again, often is a microcosm of the real world, where people will kind of be off in their own little separate silos, their own little circles. And so there are Black students, there are Latino students, there are Asian students, there are white students, but there's that diversity, but there's not enough inclusion. So it's hard to really have the environment where people are all kind of being together. And a lot of times, people will feel like they're often these little satellite groups, and the minority groups, those who are less represented, find themselves there, but on the outside. Okay. And my expression for that is that there is diversity, but there's not inclusion. And that's a big deal. And that can have an impact on you as a student. And it is a weakness of PWIs. I think that's something that they're working on, just like HBCUs are working on facilities, but that's a disadvantage, and that can be problematic. I think another disadvantage of PWIs, similar to HBCUs, is that you have a smaller population. So again, that will translate to people in your business. Okay. you will be a part of a larger school community, but if you are only a part of a smaller sect of the community, so let's say African American, again, that community will get small really fast. And again, people will be in your business. You won't have the ratio issues as much. The male female ratio is going to stay more consistent, 1-to-1, maybe 2-to-1. It won't get outrageous like the 14-to-1 at HBCUs. But again, that smaller population can lead to those similar challenges. Okay. I think another disadvantage or pitfall of a PWI is that it can be sink or swim. And what do I mean by that? That means that, you kind of either have to do for yourself and swim, or you don't do for yourself and you will sink. And what I mean by that is that I think at PWIs, they have tons of resources so that people can be successful. It is all there. If you need something, it's there. It's not that the PWI doesn't have it. Every support imaginable can be at a PWI. But if you don't take advantage of it, if you don't, become self-motivated to get the things you want for yourself and you need for yourself, you can miss out on it. Okay. There is not a lot of hand holding at PWIs. No one is going to just grab you by the arm and say, hey, you need to do this. You have to kind of want those things for yourself, and it's all there. So it's a very sink or swim environment if you are not self-motivated. So if you are not a self-motivated person, does that mean you can't go to a PWI? I'm not saying that at all. But you have to kind of know that the things are out there at arm's length and you just have to grasp them. But if you don't, you're not going to take advantage of them. So that can be, a disadvantage, and that can be a shortcoming as well. Okay. Probably one of the most, widely discussed shortcomings of PWI is just the presence of ignorance and microaggressions towards quote unquote minority or less represented peoples. And so that's going to be a common phenomenon. When you're in a community where you are one of the few, the masses are going to do ignorant things, and they're going to have aggressions towards others in ways that are kind of like needling. And I could give you a million different examples, but the short of it is, when you are an underrepresented person in a larger group, you're going to have to deal with the ignorance of the larger group, not understanding, knowing, and having experience with the underrepresented group. Okay. And so at Southland, for example, as we have underrepresented groups that have to deal with ignorance, on our campus. And you're going to find that same kind of dynamic at a PWI. And so many of an African-American or Latino student at a PWI is going to be able to share stories of how they've had to deal with ignorant people on the campus because they just didn't know better. And I always like to say that, yes, ignorance isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just the lack of knowledge. It doesn't mean that someone's evil or malicious. It's just they don't know better. And that's why people go to college, is that so they can learn better and they can learn more about the world and they can learn more about other people. But in that process, yes, it's going to be some ignorance there, and it's going to be annoying, and it's going to be a pain. And if you don't know what microaggressions are, you should look that up because that's going to be a part of the real world. Okay. So just in the way that the PWI on the pro side is going to prepare you for the real world. Some of what the real world is not cool, right? And so that can also be seen as an advantage of PWI, but also a shortcoming. So you're going to have to deal with some of the dynamics of the real world by going to a school that reflects the real world. And the biggest, disadvantage that students of color will share with PWIs is that amount of kind of ignorance and microaggressions that they have to deal with by being an underrepresented student at a PWI. Okay. And the final thing I'll share about PWIs that's a disadvantage is just the reality of the fact that the majority of social events and programming is not planned with quote unquote minorities in mind. It doesn't mean that minorities are not welcome So for example, when you go to a big football game, everyone is welcome. It's a part of the community. You're a part of that university, and everyone comes together, to cheer for the home team. But when you look around you in terms of social events, when you look at the Greek events, from the predominantly white Greek fraternities and sororities, you will see lots of social events. You'll see concerts, you'll see parties, and they're catering, generally speaking, to the majority population. Okay, so at HBCUs, for example, at homecoming, yeah, you're going to have a major, African American artist. You're going to have a major African American artist because the majority of the students are African American. So that programming is going to be made with African Americans in mind. Whereas at a PWI, you might have a huge concert that lots of people are going to, and it may be an artist that is not, targeting with African Americans in mind. We know music, for example, obviously transcends, ethnic groups and things of that nature. But the reality is, one of the disadvantages of PWIs is that many of the social events and the programming is not planned with students of color in mind. So that's a limitation. Yes, there will be, parties that are, scheduled with quote unquote minorities in mind, but the masses, the bulk of those programs are not. So if you're not the type of person who is going to, again, explore and go within those different circles of experiencing those things, it's a limitation, right? So if you're the type of kid who is only comfortable being at programs that are geared for African Americans, you're going to miss out on a lot because, truth be told, most of it is not for you. And that's a limitation. That's a shortcoming of a PWI. And if you are the type of person that does explore, like, hey, I am going to go to this event, and I'm going to go to this type of different event and this one, then it's not, it's not nearly as much as a challenge. So again, that can be a disadvantage of a PWI or a pitfall. All right. So as you can see, I could talk about this all day, but I wanted to really give you a lot of context of what PWIs and HBCUs bring to the table. The truth is there are so many advantages to both. The truth is there are many advantages that are prevalent at both types of schools. Okay. And the truth is there are going to be shortcomings at any type of school. There is no perfect school. There is no school without weakness. Every school is going to have its limitation. Doesn't matter if we're talking about, Howard University, or we're talking about, Stanford University, or anything in between that we perceive as kind of the top types of HBCUs and PWIs. Even those schools are going to have all kinds of disadvantages and shortcomings. But the reality is you have to find the greatness and the goodness in every school. But hopefully I've given you a few things to think about. Hopefully I've put some things on your head that you hadn't considered. And hopefully you have those options. The whole point of our process is that you should be able to be accepted to all kinds of different types of schools. And over the next couple of months, we'll evaluate those schools and make a choice. But my hope in this video is to shed some light on what these different types of schools bring to the table and some of the shortcomings that go with it. What I am going to do after this video is I'm going to share some contacts with you of Southland alums who are at some of some of the top HBCUs and some of the top PWIs, so you can get perspective from them. And I think they would certainly echo a lot of my sentiments. But at the end of the day, you're going to be great. You're going to be amazing wherever you choose to go. And college is always going to be what you make of it. Okay. So regardless of what advantages, an HBCU brings to the table, regardless of what advantages a PWI brings to the table, none of it will happen if you don't make it happen. So you got to get on that campus and take it all in, take in all the greatness, and wherever there are shortcomings, work to make it better. All right. That's all for now. And again, I hope you enjoyed the video.